I'm Saif Zabara. I'm a cybersecurity analyst at the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on Isn't That Data Public? What's the Big Deal? As we proceed with our webinar session today, it is with acknowledgement of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis nations and communities who have been harmed by colonial and unethical research and of the data sovereignty and research priorities of these nations and communities. On behalf of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, we commit to understanding and taking up our role in reducing harm and advancing reconciliation in research. So the Alliance seeks to provide a welcoming, engaging, and safe community for everyone. So discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform. The Alliance does not tolerate harassment in any form. Harassment is understood as any behavior that threatens another person or group or produces an unsafe environment. We thank you in advance for your ongoing efforts in keeping our environments safe and welcoming. So our speaker today is Scott Baker, who manages the research, cybersecurity, and compliance teams at UBC Advanced Research Computing, a group focused on supporting researchers to find secure solutions for their project architectures and research data, as well as navigating compliance requirements. He is a member of the Program Leadership Committee for UBC's Privacy and Information Security Management Program. He is also a member of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada National Security Council, where he chairs the governance and policy workshop. I'll stop sharing my screen. You can start sharing yours, Scott.
Sounds good. Give me one sec. All right. Hello, everybody. As was noted, feel free to ask questions. I'm able to watch those as I go. So if it's something I can answer on the fly, I'll do that, or it might be something I'll save till the end. This session starts with a little bit of history about how I ended up doing it, because it's a bit unusual. So back last year, we were looking for what we could have sessions about as part of our data privacy awareness month and week. And I said, oh, I'd really like to know more about data scraping and what the privacy and legal implications of that are. And a whole bunch of other people said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Why don't you give a presentation on it? So I got stuck doing this, even though I really didn't know a lot about it at the time. So this presentation is actually a bit of a research project of my own, trying to figure out what's going on in this space. And I think what a lot of us have found is what we really want are some clear-cut rules around exactly what we can do and what we can't do when it comes to scraping data off websites and online, and some of the issues around that, especially in today's world with so much data being required for the training of large language models and other AI machine learning models. So everybody kind of wants is just, what are the rules? What's the textbook? Unfortunately, what we kind of have is just a whole bunch of questions. So I'm going to see what I can do to answer some of those questions, and work through basically my process for how I figured out what I was able to figure out. I'll give you a spoiler in advance, though. If you're looking for a clear-cut answer, I'm not going to be able to provide that because there really isn't one, but you'll see why in a sec. So we should probably start with what is data scraping anyway, if we're talking about data scraping, and kind of exactly how you would scope this as an area of concern. So if we look at the privacy commissioners and what they're defining it as, they're talking about data scraping involves the automated extraction of data from the web. So it's not something that I'm doing or you're doing or a particular researcher's doing and taking notes as they go. This is some automated system doing that. Wikipedia says something very similar. It's a technique where a computer program extracts the data from web pages or other human readable output from another program. So that's what it refers to with data scraping, and that's going to be my scope for this session, is really automatic extraction of data. I mentioned questions. So a lot of those come around to the can I do it? And if I want to know if I can do it, I have to look at, okay, what are my policies that apply? Do I need permission? And if so, who can give it to me? How does copyright factor into this? Does it matter why I'm scraping the data? What about the laws in Canada? What about the laws outside of Canada? If I am going to do it, how should I do it? And then are there any implications if I do it, train a ML model, a machine learning model on it, and then want to use that model? Are there implications in that? And then sort of the last one, which is sort of the flip side of this, is let's say I have data and I don't want people scraping it. So how do I prevent others from doing that? And this has become a bigger and bigger issue. And we'll talk about that as I go forward as well. Precursor to what I'm going to talk about, I've used references from UBC's policies as an example. Your institution may have slightly different policies, may have wildly different policies. From what I've seen in landscape analysis over the years, most Canadian academic institutions have fairly similar policies in these regards. So I think the examples I'm going to provide are quite typical. One of the other reasons I like the ones from UBC is because they're publicly available. So any of the policy or webpage links or documents I reference, you can actually find on the UBC public websites. So you'll be able to go and look at it if you wish. So I started, as I usually do, being a governance and compliance and policy person with looking up the main policy on information systems for the institution and wanted to see what it had to say about stuff like this. So it talks about prohibited uses of systems and kind of doubling down on the you can't examine the contents without authorization. And I'm going to highlight that word authorization because we're going to keep coming back to it as we move through these various things. It talks about copyright and you can't infringe on the copyright. And it talks about not accessing or examining files, communications, or information, again, without authorization. So this authorization piece is pretty important. Now, because we're really looking at this from a research lens, I also went and looked at the research policy. And it has different kind of wording, but it kind of relates. So it's talking about making sure you follow ethical and professional standards. You have to do it under the auspices of scholarly integrity, which again is a fairly consistent concept across most academic institutions. And then it also talks about doing this safely and in accordance with all applicable laws and regulations. I always find that funny to say you have to do things under the law because obviously you do, even if you didn't write that down, you'd still have to. But again, it gives us other things that we could look into. Okay, so we've got to look at authorization, ethics, we've got to look at laws and make sure we're going according to policy. So no real surprises here, I don't think, for any of this stuff, but it's interesting that it's actually codified and written down. So the first thing I did is went and talked to some of my colleagues over in ethics, because ethics is all about any research involving people and or animals, and they will look at these kind of questions as, is it appropriate to do? So I asked my colleague in the ethics department, and their first response to me was, well, it used to be somewhat straightforward, now it's more complicated, which wasn't, again, terribly definitive, but it did kind of speak to the fact that there's questions even in the ethics spheres around exactly what's appropriate when it comes to data scraping. They went on to provide a little bit more detail and spoke to the privacy and confidentiality aspects of how ethics might play into this. So this would be looking a little bit more at the nature of the data you're scraping. So if you're scraping information about temperatures in a rainforest, ethics wouldn't really apply. But if it's anything to do with people, and you're collecting, using, or disclosing any of their information, again, we get back to these applicable laws, regulatory requirements, and they have a very important feature in ethics that it has a lot to do with how much information is involved. So this concept of proportionality and the risk to the population and the people that are involved in that study that might be going on. So if you're scraping the data of 2 people, especially if you have consent, that's very different than if you're scraping the data of an entire population in a country or a province or a city. That's a very vastly different set of proportionality. So that helps a little, but again, not too much in terms of giving us a definitive look on what we can and can't do. So maybe we should look at this concept of authorization. And I thought this is a good way to look at it with maybe a bit of an analogy. So a lot of what I hear is that, well, it's on the web. I can access it. There's no login. It's there, so it's public. So, what's the problem? Just as in the session title says, it's public data. What's the issue? So let's look at an analogy. Let's compare that public data to public transit. So if we're thinking about public transit, pretty much anybody can see it. It's there. It's right in front of us. Big bus, hard to miss. You can access it or use it. And technically, you're supposed to pay, but I don't know how it is in other cities. But in Vancouver, if somebody gets on the bus and doesn't pay, the bus driver doesn't say anything. They just merrily go on their way. Technically, they're not allowed to do that, but they do it all the time. So, okay, we've got a public transit bus. We see it. We can access it and use it. But if you jump on that bus and try to drive it away for your own purposes, that's not going to be so kosher. That you don't have authorization to do. So you'd probably get arrested if you tried to do something like that. And you have to look at your public data in a similar sense. It's not just that you have it there for any use. The authorization to use it is quite specific to how you're going to use it. And how do we find out what that is? Most websites will have a terms of use. You may not always see it front and center. It's usually when you scroll down to the bottom of the web page, there'll be a little link there. It says terms of use or authorized use or user agreement. There's lots of different ways they can phrase it, but most websites will have this, and it's fairly easy to spot. So let's look at a couple examples. So again, I just went to the UBC one, and if you go to ubc.ca and scroll to the bottom, you'll see legal information and terms of use. And this is what it has to say. So there's a bunch of copyright information that's important in this case, but we'll talk about copyright later. The bit here that's important, I've bolded, is that none of the information may be otherwise reproduced, republished, or redisseminated in any manner or any form, again, without the prior written consent of the university. So that's pretty clear. In other words, no, don't touch our information and use it for some other means. You can read it. You can digest it for your own purposes to understand stuff, and that's why it's publicly put out there. But you're not allowed to reproduce it, republish it, or redisseminate it in any manner or form. So that, again, pretty clear. Maybe another example. I went to LinkedIn. This one is similar, and they're talking about, again, all the information on the site. So you cannot copy, use, display, distribute any information, including content obtained from the services. And doesn't even matter whether you get it directly or via some other source. And we'll talk about that coming up later as well. You can't redistribute it. It's really interesting and important to note that with LinkedIn and typically of all social media sites, anything that you as a user of the site put on the website becomes theirs. And you grant them a non-exclusive license to use it. So they've kind of gone the opposite way. You can't use our data, they're saying, but we can use all of your data. And that's very typical of almost all social media sites. So if you're uncomfortable with that, keep it in mind before you post something on any social media site. That's why it's also a really good idea to read the terms and conditions. Another interesting one is the Government of Canada's website. So I thought, well, let's see what they have to say. They've got a more nuanced approach. So they're quite specific. If you're using the data off their website for non-commercial reproduction, unless they've said otherwise, you can. You can do it in any format without charge, without further permission, as long as you, and I've shortened it because it was quite a long statement, but basically they want you to say where you got it. So you have to say you got this information from the Government of Canada website. I think they want you to specify where, but that's fine to use. So for the Government of Canada, you're good to go as long as you put attribution for where you got the data. However, if you want to use it for commercial reproduction, then you need prior written permission from the copyright administrator. So they've made the distinction of the use of the data and the nature under which you're collecting it as a contributing factor to whether or not you can take that data from their website or not. Next up is, okay, so we've got these terms and conditions, but how do you deal with that as an automated system? Because remember, we're looking at data scraping from an automatic means. So in that case, we have something that was originally put together to control the way search engines index the web. And it's for those who have ever done any web development, you'll be familiar with the concept of a robots.txt file. This is just a text file that sits in a particular place on the website. It's right in the root folder, actually. And automated systems that are going to look at that website are supposed to read this file first. And this file, through some specific encoding, I won't get into the details, it's pretty simple, can say whether or not parts of the website, all of the website, or just bits of it are allowed to be indexed or not, and allowed to be visited or not by the automatic bot. So in theory, if you don't want a scraping bot or automated system to go and look at your website, you should be able to just specify that in the robot.txt file and say which, and you can get down to, like, you can visit these 3 folders, these 3 paths, but not these other paths. So you can be right down to specific URLs on a website where you don't want them indexed versus do want them indexed. So that's another way to, in theory, and I'll explain why in theory, control that. The problem with this theory is it's up to the automated system to respect this file. You're just posting a text file that says, this is what I'd like. It's up to the other party to actually say, yes, I'm going to follow what you're asking about. So next is about copyright. Copyright is a pretty important one in this space, because copyright in Canada, at least, and it's fairly similar in a lot of jurisdictions, but I'm going to focus specifically on Canada. And I'll also note that I am not a copyright lawyer, so this is based on information that I've looked up. Do your own research here as well. But again, I've leveraged a lot of resources from the UBC websites and reference materials. So we have a website that talks about copyright guidelines for faculty, staff, and students. And it's talking about whether or not you can use content from a copyrighted source, which in Canada, everything that's created by a person ever is automatically copyrighted right away. As soon as you publish it, it's copyrighted. As soon as you create it, actually. So the first test they're looking at in terms of, can you do what they refer to as fair dealing, which is use of that material. And 2 of the cases that directly apply to us are research and education. So they do fall into this clause. Those are the allowable purposes under the first test. You can also do it for private study, which makes sense. Satire, parody, criticism, review, or news reporting. So every time somebody in the news references an article somewhere, they're not breaking the copyright laws, because that's been enshrined into the copyright law that you can reference a little excerpt of something in order to quote it or refer to it in a manuscript or something else. And those are what are referred to as fair dealing. This short excerpt part is quite important, though. They're allowing you to take an excerpt of it, not the whole thing. And obviously, somebody has tried to work around this in the past, because they go further to say copying multiple short excerpts so that you basically get the whole of the work is similarly prohibited. So you can't say, you can't copy the whole thing. You can't copy the whole thing in 10,000 little pieces either. Either one is prohibited. You're allowed one short excerpt. And what does that short excerpt mean? Because this is pretty critical. It's 10% or less of a work is one definition, or no more than a chapter of a book, a single article, a single artistic work, a newspaper article, or an entire entry from an encyclopedia. So that's what you're allowed to do, and it's whichever is greater. So you can't, if you've got a huge book, you can get a single chapter as a short excerpt, or maybe if you have something that's just an essay, you can take 10% of that. So those are just some examples. So if we think about mass data scraping of entire reams of websites, we quite clearly have a copyright issue in that respect, because without, again, authorization, you're not taking a short excerpt, you're taking the whole thing. So this is a problem. There are other problems, though, that come up with mass data scraping, and that's resource overload. Data scraping is generally done with automated systems that visit the website en masse. It's not like one script going to the website and getting one bit of information at a time. They're often coming in groups, multiple streams that are attacking the website effectively with download requests for a whole bunch of stuff all at the same time. And this has become such an issue right now on the internet as a whole because of the desire for massive amounts of data to train machine learning models that we're actually seeing the scraping bots taking websites offline, which is effectively the same as a DDoS attack. And it's so predominant now that some websites aren't sure if they're being attacked or it's data scraping. And an excellent example was this Triple Gangers website. They produce 3D likenesses of random individuals for use in games or other 3D assets. And OpenAI was scraping their website, and it used over 600 different IPs to scrape the data all at the same time. And it basically took the website completely offline. Their website wasn't capable of delivering that much content. It's a small, somewhat niche website that is used to a limited amount of traffic, certainly not 600 unique IPs all at the same time. And I'm well aware that this is attacking researchers' websites right now. It's a big issue across the internet. Big companies like Cloudflare are trying to introduce ways to block this. And as I mentioned before, we have the facility of the robots.txt file, but unfortunately, most of these AI bots are completely ignoring that. So they're basically saying, we don't care that you don't want us to do this, we're going to do it anyway. And it's causing a lot of problems. Not only does this potentially bring down the website on the far end, so this is the web server of whatever company is being scraped, when you start doing 600 downloads at the same time on an institutional network, you might be stressing your institutional network as well. It's hard to tell. It depends on how your network topology is set up. It might be a problem if you're doing it from somewhere outside the institution. Don't know. But it's certainly a lot, that level of data all at once from multiple different sources. And these are lots and lots of small files, not a big data transfer, which there's some optimizations that can be done to make that work better. This is like thousands of little ones all at the same time, can definitely stress a network. So trying to scrape can also cause problems just with the technology and the resources between whatever's doing the scraping and whatever's being scraped. So it's another factor that needs to be taken into account. And when you start looking at some of these things, you have to look at some more extreme cases that come up. And when I was researching this, I asked some of my colleagues at the Security Council for the Alliance, hey, what else would you think of? Have you encountered anything that might relate to mass data scraping or AI data scraping? And one of the people there said, have you looked at the criminal code? And I thought, no, I haven't. Let's go see what it says. So the criminal code actually makes it a felony to fraudulently or without color of right obtain directly or indirectly any computer service. Now this, again, I'm saying this is an extreme example because I don't think there's a lot of desire to try to go and prosecute people under the criminal code for data scraping. It would have to be pretty heinous in order to do that. But it's interesting to note that it's covered. And it's also covered in section 430, calling it a mischief who willfully obstructs, interrupts, or interferes with a person in the lawful use of a computer, its data, or denies access to a computer data to a person who is entitled to access it. So taking a website offline because you're scraping it so vehemently is covered right there. So again, very interesting to now realize that potentially, and again, I don't think it's ever been done, but potentially this could be a felony offense under the criminal code if you're scraping inappropriately. So the next thing when you start thinking about copyright violations, criminal code violations, you're going to think, wow, is the legal system involved? You bet. There are a ridiculous number of lawsuits going on right now that cover this specific issue. And I wanted to get some examples, and there were so many lawsuits that I just couldn't. I instead tried to break it down by the category of lawsuits. And in each of these categories, there's hundreds of cases that are currently before the courts. So there's the copyright and other infringement of journalism, of books, and of music. There's harmful outcomes where people have scraped data and then used it inappropriately, leading to somebody's wrongful arrest. Digital redlining. A digital redline is when somebody is restricted access to a service they should otherwise be granted access based on a computer decision. And so people have been denied housing, denied employment, and then other people are claiming libel. So in each one of these categories, there's hundreds of lawsuits and various other civil cases that are currently before the courts. So many so that it's impossible to just collect the list. But feel free to go and have a look. I did find one that kind of relates to use as an example. So I thought, okay, let's look at this. This one's fairly well known, the Clearview AI. If you haven't heard of Clearview, they're a company that is trying to use social media images to generate a facial recognition database that can be used by law enforcement, and well, not can be, is being used by law enforcement. So there was something held here, and this is the outcome of it. So this is one of the few court cases that has been looked at. Most of these are still before the courts, but this particular one, the decision was that even though this data was publicly available, it wasn't deemed to be a reasonable purpose of the use of that public data. So the court agreed with the privacy commissioner that the privacy protection laws apply to the activities of Clearview. So it's really quite interesting. This is one of the first ones, and this one's fairly generic. There's some much more specific cases that are coming up, and I see somebody mentioned in chat OpenAI's Sora depicting copyrighted characters. Yeah, this is a big problem with almost all the AI models that do image or video. They're easily able to reproduce well-known people. But is that okay? Is that copyrighted or not? If you think back to what the copyright laws say, you would think so. And that leads to a very interesting question. What are the implications if you're using a model to do something else? And as a result of all these court cases, it's determined that the model was trained illegally or inappropriately. And that model is then, we don't know what will happen. The courts might choose probably, and most likely would, to just fine the company that did it. But will they also say that model can no longer be used because it's not been trained with data that they had authorization to use? If that's the case, and you've built a derivative model on top of it, what does that mean for your model? So just for those who might not have delved as deeply into some of the ways that machine learning models work, quite often there's a base model trained or a foundational model. They go by different names. And this is a model that tries to learn as like the everything. So if I was building an image model, I would want to train that model with as many different images and in many different styles and subject matter as I possibly could. And that makes a very general, broad purpose model. It tends to not be very good at specific things. So what a lot of people then do is they fine tune that model to their specific needs. So if I wanted to only make models of coffee cups, I could take a generic foundation model and fine tune it on a whole bunch more pictures of just coffee cups. And maybe all the coffee cup pictures I took myself. And so I was not violating anybody's copyright. I didn't scrape them off the web. I didn't do anything else. I just had my own coffee cup pictures and I fine tuned that model. My use of my coffee cup pictures is categorically perfectly fine. But the question is, what if that base model that I used is somehow later determined to be not fine? Can I still use my coffee cup model? And this plays into a lot of issues that might come and face our researchers in the future. If their base models have been trained and determined to be not appropriate, what does that mean about the subsequent derivative models they may be using those base models to train against? And again, I don't have an answer here. It's just something to think about. So there's been some discussions about this from privacy commissioners. There is actually a pair of statements. The QR code there, I think, links to the one that's listed. There's a joint statement on data scraping, and there's a concluding joint statement on data scraping. There are a little bit of time separating the two because they put out the initial statement, and then they took a bunch of feedback and had some consultations and put out a concluding statement thereafter. And it's been endorsed by a bunch of different privacy officers. You can see the list there. I think it's interesting, some of the list entries that are there and some that are not. I was quite surprised to see China on the list. And given the timing of this, I was also surprised not to see the US on the list. But I would have been less surprised now. Yeah, somebody else noticed that in the chat too. Yep, they're not on there. Which is, of course, very interesting because most of the social media companies and large AI companies are based in the States. So what does that mean? Don't know. Anyway, you can have a look at this statement. There's a lot of interesting information there. It's really focused around the privacy of individuals and social media. That's their main scope. So it's not necessarily as generic as I'm referring to here, but it is still worth a read. The TLDR on this one is really that personal information that's publicly accessible is still subject to data protection and privacy laws. That was what they've concluded. So just because it's posted on the web doesn't mean you can use it for whatever you like. You still have to protect it as personal information, even if it's publicly posted. That's the long and the short of what the statement says. And they're not covering search engines, but they are covering automatic extraction of personal data. So again, it's specifically talking about data scraping and not so much just indexing the data. And there's been lots of discussion about this as well as we look at how are search engines adapting and changing from something that gives you links to something that is now more increasingly giving you an AI summary of the data. So now we're not just linking to data, we're actually summarizing it and we're repurposing it. And that's could fall into this automatic extraction. I think when this statement was originally written, the AI summary space was not as big. So they took that less into account and they were more thinking about training models based on data scraping, but it's still worth thinking about. So I talked a lot about authorization. So how do you get authorization? And what does it look like? So one of the easiest things to do, ask. You can always ask somebody, hey, you've got this website with great information. Can I use it for my research project? And one of the nice things about doing that is you might not need to data scrape at all. Remember how the data scraping is actually quite stressful on their website. It's stressful on the network between. It's often not very efficient way to get information because then you have to parse it and you have to write scripts to digest what is designed to be presented to a human and turn it into something that's useful for a machine. So quite often, if you do get permission, they're going to say, well, don't scrape it off our website. Instead, we'd much rather just give you a zip file that you can download in one go that has all the data in it. Or maybe they'll give you API access to a database. Or maybe they'll say, okay, you can access our website, you can scrape from it, but do it only like 1 page a minute or something. And they'll slow down the rate. And they might also have restrictions. It's like, yeah, you can use it for this research project, but that's it. Once you're done, you'd have to ask again for some other appropriate authorization. And in almost all these cases, there's going to be some form of agreement or documented understanding, an MOU, an agreement between data sharing agreement between whoever's getting the data and whoever's supplying the data. And that's a key factor of what authorization looks like. There should be something in writing. So there's some other interesting aspects, and since the last time I gave this presentation, this is a new one I'd found out about, and I don't know, there's a lot of chat going on, so I know, can tell some people have some experience in this space. I don't know who is already familiar with Common Crawl. So this is an interesting idea. It's been actually around since 2007. It's a web automated scraping service that goes out and scrapes a whole bunch of websites and then takes that information and stores it in a database and says, don't go out and scrape all these websites, just come and get it from us. And then you save, and their goal, which is noble, is to save this problem of going out and having 12 different companies all trying to scrape from the same website at the same time with 600 bots that's killing the whole internet with all this scraping activity. And I know anybody here that's done any sort of edge firewall monitoring will be well aware of just how much of this scraping is going on right now. It's more than 50% of the traffic on a lot of public websites. It's quite ridiculous. So I wanted to look into this a little bit more and find out, okay, well, what do they do about respecting the robots.txt file? And they say they do. They say, yep, just configure your robots.txt to block their user agent. They're clear about what their user agent is. They actually list the IP addresses they use. So it would be very easy to block them if you didn't want them to come to your website. But I also was curious about the copyright issue. What if somebody doesn't block them in their robots.txt? Because, like me, until a few months ago, I'd never heard of these guys. And they've done an interesting thing with respect to the copyright issue. They've basically pushed it over to whoever's using the data. They're saying, effectively, it's not our problem. We've copied this information. You shouldn't use it unless you talk to your legal counsel. And you are responsible for making sure it's okay to use this information. So they've completely ignored the copyright issue, and they've left it to you to sort out whether or not, for all this mass database that you might be downloading from them, to somehow go back and find out if it's okay to use this content or not. So an interesting case. It's certainly better than just having everybody going out and scraping the internet all at the same time, but it doesn't solve the content issue at all. And that's my segue to talk about, okay, let's look at this from the flip side. What if I actually have information and I don't want people scraping that information? What do I do about it? How do I protect my data? So maybe I'm a researcher. I want to publish out my study information on a knowledge transfer website, but I don't want it being scooped up by a whole bunch of different companies who might be completely ignoring the robots.txt restrictions that I've asked for. So I went and looked at the Privacy Commissioner again, because they're really focused on individuals and social media. They were really giving advice for people and saying, well, you know, if you're posting anything, you should read the privacy policy. You should read what and SMC stands for social media company. You should find out what they're posting and think about what information you're sharing and understand and manage whatever privacy settings they may have, and think about the long term. This is a really important one, especially for parents. If they're posting pictures of their kids, those pictures of their kids, unless they're thinking carefully about it, might end up in who knows what model down the road, be able to be reproduced. The kid might not want that later on, so something to keep in mind. But this, again, really about social media, and really about personal information. What about other stuff? What about non-personal information? What about non-social media? So this is a concern for a bunch of different people. And there's a few things people have been trying to do to circumvent it. And one of them is a concept of intentionally poisoning the information that AI might ingest. Some interesting things. There's two here that you can look up if you want. One is called Nightshade and the other is called Glaze. This is specifically around attempting to poison AI models that are slurping image data. So what they do, Nightshade will try to corrupt the feature recognition in an image. And it adds completely invisible pixelation level data to the picture, so that when you and I look at it as humans, we don't see any difference at all. Picture looks exactly the same. But when AI ingests it, it will see a picture of a cat, and AI will somehow interpret that as a picture of something completely different. And the end result is the AI model, the whole model itself, starts to become corrupted with this information and becomes somewhat useless. Glaze is a similar concept where the goal is to change out a style. So in image AI, you'll find quite often you're either prompting for a particular concept, like I want a coffee cup, or you're wanting a style, like I want a coffee cup in the style of Leonardo da Vinci pencil drawing or something like that. So Glaze is trying to corrupt the style type ingestion, and Nightshade is trying to corrupt subject or feature ingestion. That's a bit of a extreme example, but it's something that a lot of artists are starting to take into account, because again, they can then publish their art without as much fear of it being ingested and abused without their permission. Another thing that people are doing is creating tar pits. And you'll remember that I mentioned that a lot of the AI scrapers right now are completely ignoring the robots.txt files or any other directives you might do. I didn't mention it, but they also work very hard to get around blocks. That's why big companies like Cloudflare are spending all kinds of time trying to come up with better and better ways to block these things because people don't want them on their website. I saw another note in chat, and I hadn't mentioned this either. This can be very expensive if you're running your website on a cloud service that charges you by bandwidth, and there's 600 different bots coming and downloading everything on your website every like few seconds. That gets really pricey really quick. So what some people have done is create a tar pit. They put in their robots.txt file, whatever you do, don't go to this folder. And then in that folder, they create effectively a never-ending labyrinth of fake information, fake pictures, fake links that will just keep a bot in there for days at a time, where it's downloading a whole bunch of meaningless information. It slows down the bot. It pollutes the model with meaningless information. And this is their kind of, you wouldn't have been there if you'd followed the robots.txt file. Now, again, this is kind of like the attack back cybersecurity concept, and it's questionable whether that's, in a gray area or still very much wearing a white hat, or maybe it's wearing a black hat. But it's interesting to consider what this does. The downside of it for somebody deploying a tar pit, of course, is that they now have all these bots living in these tar pits for days on end, which is also consuming a ton of resources. So even this Nepenthes, I never can pronounce the name. It's the type of flower that eats the bugs. Has huge warnings in their Git repo that says, if you're going to deploy this, make sure you have the resources to handle it. Because if you get 600 different bots from 12 different companies all at the same time going and trying to scoop all the data in your massive tar pit, which often is procedurally generated, so it just never ends, you might, take your own website down by just trying to run the tar pit in the first place. But again, it's another defense that people are looking to deploy. Another very interesting one is something called model autophagy disorder. And again, don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. There's a study paper on this. And it's also pretty interesting. There have been a bunch of different groups. This is one, they've called it MAD. There's a few groups that have given it other names. But what they're researching is, as AI models, ML specifically models, start to get trained more and more on data that have been generated from AI models, what happens? So I think anybody here that's done a search in any online search engine in the recent past, in the last 3 months for sure, will have found that half of the results there are actually AI results. Pictures especially, there's tons of AI out there that is just AI pictures. There's tons of other things out there that you're going to see. So if we're seeing it, the bots that are scoping the information, they're also seeing it. And what does that do? Well, what they're finding is the more you train a machine learning model on material that has been generated by other machine learning models, the poorer and poorer quality that model gets, up to a point at which it becomes completely useless. So this is also an interesting concept. Are we inadvertently leading to a self-defeating model where the training of this information that's becoming pervasive on the internet is actually going to destroy the ability to create new models unless they somehow don't use it? So now you've got a situation where the companies that are trying to scrape the content from the web have to be careful not to scrape content that was generated by their own model, because it might damage their model, which is a bit of a mind bender. But other proponents are saying this is actually maybe a good thing because it'll slow down the whole data scraping debacle that's going on. So again, something very interesting to keep in mind. So that was my research project to try to figure out what was going on. And it led to, obviously, hopefully you've reached some of the same conclusions that I did. So first of all is step one, especially for researchers, get authorization. You really can't just go out and scrape data online without asking first. You need to find out if it adheres to the policy of whichever organization under which you're conducting the research. You need to consider copyright, which generally means talking to the copyright owner and seeing if it's okay. Make sure you're not breaking any laws. Make sure ethics is good with what you're going to do. Because again, ethics might say, yeah, you've talked to the website, LinkedIn, and they'd said, yeah, sure, take all the information. But under Canadian privacy law, they're saying, well, that needs to be treated as personal information of all those individuals. You're going to need consent. And how would you do that? You also need to look at the terms of use. So by getting authorization, you're covering off a lot of things, but it's not just as simple as asking who's the website owner, because, for example, Common Crawl is going to say, yeah, sure, go ahead. That doesn't cover copyright, doesn't cover personal information. You still have to deal with those things. It's also really important, assuming you are okay in all those above steps to go and do data scraping on a website, you really want to talk to the IT department, and especially the network department, probably also the security department of whatever institution you're working with, because that is going to be a lot of traffic, and it might be unusual traffic. So even if the scraping traffic you're doing doesn't necessarily get to a point where you're going to be taking down somebody's website, it might get you to a point where you're going to get your institution blocked by some sort of an automated system that's checking to make sure that people aren't abusing things online. So you might have a permission from the website owner, but automatic network detection systems are going to go, whoa, this is weird. We're going to shut down that IP. And now all of a sudden your entire institution doesn't have access to something that they should. So again, you want to do this with the full knowledge of everyone involved and authorization of the data owner. And then finally, it's really important to consider, is the data you're scraping actually going to be what you want to be putting into the model you're scraping it for? So is it potentially poisoned? Is it more AI generated content that's actually going to degrade your model over time? And is the intended use of your model appropriate for the information you're collecting? And that last one comes to, I think, one of the ones that's fairly easy for us to understand. If we think about how often we go online and do a search for something. I'm trying to find information about X. So I go online and I do a search and I get back a whole bunch of different links and I start going through these links. About half of the information out there is quite often just wrong. It's not very good information. It's maybe full of inaccuracies. This is very true of computer code forums. You can go and see how to do something and you go look at that and go, no, that can't possibly be right. And it isn't. The problem is the AI will just happily ingest all that information. So if you're just scraping information and just plopping it into a machine learning model without vetting it first, you might be populating your model with garbage. And that's when they talk about models hallucinating, that's why. Well, it's not the only reason why, but it's part of the reason why. Even if they get everything right, they still might be wrong because the information they were trained with might also be wrong. So a bunch of different things to keep in mind. The authorization, I would say, is probably the key one, followed by resources, and then followed by thinking about what you're actually doing. But that authorization piece, because it often will come with, if you actually get authorization, a better way to get the information than scraping, which might save you tons of time, lots of money, and everybody a lot of heartache and resource depletion. It's always the best thing to do first. So obviously, I think there's still questions about what's going on in this space. There's a lot of uncertain legality. What happens with all these court cases as they move forward? What happens with the court cases in the States, given the current situation in the States? Hard to tell. I don't expect any of these are going to be answered anytime soon. There's certainly a lot of money involved and a lot of uncertainty involved, but it'll be very interesting to see where that goes. So I can open it up now. We have a few more minutes here for anybody that might have some questions. I see a couple in the chat. I think I've covered some of these, but I'll just run through them quickly. Does it matter if a person scraping versus a robot or AI? So that was up, and I think it was up just before I tried to answer that slide. So yes, it definitely does. Although if you sat there and copied and pasted the entire content of a website, you'd still be in trouble with copyright most likely. So it depends on again, the copyright side of it. I would say anytime you want to use information off a website, or somebody else's information, seek authorization first, but it's certainly more important if you're going to try to do it automatically. And the second one is, aren't most AI models built on, I think it's supposed to be swaths of copyright material scraped en masse? Yes, absolutely they are. And that's where a lot of the lawsuits are coming from. Right now, effectively, there's a bunch of people saying this was fine, it was public data. There once basically the AI companies are saying that. And a whole bunch of other people are saying, no, it's not fine, it was copyrighted data. You never should have done this in the first place. And that's what the crux of many of those court cases actually is. It's people trying to determine now before the courts, what is the answer to that question of whether this was okay or not. When I read the copyright laws, it seems pretty clear, but opinions vary. And obviously, again, there's a lot of money involved. So that's kind of where things are at with the court cases. And court cases of this nature don't grow quickly or get resolved quickly. So I think we're in for a bit of a wait before we find out anything, certainly a few years at least. And that begs the question. I mean, at this point, the cat is kind of out of the bag. The horse has left the barn. How would they say, yeah, you know, that AI model that all the rest of the AI models were built in that was back in 2023? Yeah, that was illegal. You can't use that. And what do you do? I mean, you can't say, well, all the subsequent models forever can't be used anymore. It's too late. People have them downloaded to their home machines. So what do you do? I see a shout out in the chat for Cory Doctorow. And I'll double down on that one. Cory is great. If you haven't read any of his material, you can find his blog at puralistic.com, I think. I'd have to check that. But he does a whole bunch of position papers and strategy documents and concepts around AI investments, and his recently coined and very popular term and shitification of the internet. Thanks. Puralistic.net. Thanks, Nathan. So Cory has lots to say on this subject. He's got a very strong opinion. I tend to agree with him, but just be aware his opinions are quite strong. You can tell from the terms he coins that he's not shy of harsh language, but it's really worth a read. There's some interesting concepts there. We have 4 more minutes, and I need to give a little bit of time for Saif at the end. Were there any other questions that anybody wanted to ask? I can see them in either the Q&A or the chat.
Just if anyone has also a question, they can put their hand up and I can give them a chance to speak directly.
Yeah. Give it a sec and see if anybody has any thoughts. I'm just reading the rest of the chat. The bots are now eating themselves. Yeah, no kidding. There's a mention in the chat about adversarial AI where threat actors use AI directly against their targets. Yeah, I didn't even touch on that because I really wanted to focus on the data scraping. But yes, that is another very interesting area to look at from a cybersecurity perspective, that we have the situation where just as AI scraping bots can be used to DDoS websites unintentionally, we have the potential to have them filling out forms, doing all kinds of things intentionally and with malicious intent. So, and that goes beyond just web pages. We can do it with email. That the nature of phishing has completely changed over the years, thanks to AI. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's dramatically changing. And as we get into creating agents that are based on AI with all of these other factors thrown in, it's a bit of a cybersecurity folks like me are nervous. We'll put it that way. It's not the best time to be not clear on how you defend against some of these potential attacks. Great, thanks, Robert. And we're back to critical thinking and media literacy. Yeah, no kidding. One question from Jeff, and then I'll turn it over to Saeed. So thoughts on jurisdictional safe havens for AI training? Singapore recently passed some legislation allowing for the use of copyrighted work for computational data analysis. Yeah, and I saw mentioned earlier on about data residency. That is a very interesting thing because, of course, the internet is global. So that's why I thought it was really interesting. China was on the list of ones who had talked about joined in the privacy commissioners. Yeah, what if you train your model in a place that really could care less about copyright? Then what? in theory, then that model might not be legal in other jurisdictions, but how do you police that? So we have this issue happening right now in a different vein online with respect to age verification, where in some jurisdictions you can't access sites like Blue Sky or Discord or even aspects of Netflix and stuff without providing government issued ID scans to that company to make sure that you're of age. Whereas other jurisdictions don't. So now we've got people using VPNs to get around all that. So would that same kind of thing happen with AI models? Yeah, probably. But it's another interesting, enforcement of that, challenging to say the least, nearly impossible, I would think. Anyway, hope and seems like we provoked some thought, which is great. But I need to turn it back over to Saif so he can close us out. Thanks for the chat. For those who are participating. That's awesome.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. I actually had a couple of questions, but I'll just send them over because I think we're a bit out of time. Let me just.
I can stay. I'm happy to stay a little bit after if anybody wants to chat going forward.
Okay. Can you see my screen, or is it back to this?
Back to the tiny little one.
Oh, okay. Let me just. All right, thank you very much, Scott. That was an interesting presentation. Just to mention here the upcoming sessions that we have. So the sessions we'll have until October 30th. So please do attend those coming up and register and attend. And if you have any more questions, you can please send those questions to nsc-cybersecurity-training-awareness@gw.alliancecan.ca. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, Saif. And thanks, everybody. And I'm happy to stay. Saif, if you want to ask questions, I'm happy to stay for a bit.
Yeah, and so my question was basically about what your thoughts are on the future of training LLMs, because that's basically the lifeline of LLMs. And you talked a little bit about restrictions that could inhibit, scraping some of that data, like the poisoning the data, like restricting some parts of the websites, and lawsuits. So what are your thoughts on the future of how to train LLMs?
I mean,
how would it look like?
If you want to do it, well, first we need to find out what the courts say in terms of the legality of it. Again, I mean, I think there's some strong opinions on each end of the spectrum, and until the courts rule on that, we won't really know what the legality will end up being. If the courts rule that yes, all the copyright laws apply, and you can't just train models based on anything without authorization, it's going to be a very different situation than if they rule the other way. So that's a factor. But that notwithstanding, I mean, if you want to look at the most ethical way to do this stuff, then you have to collect the information with authorization to use it for that purpose. And it will limit the data set for sure, because there's groups that just will say, no, I don't want you using my stuff for this purpose. And that'll be a factor that'll have to be ruled in, worked into how you train the LLM or any other ML model for that purpose. It might require a lot more effort to be putting into generating content yourself. So if you want to train an image model, maybe what you have to do is go out and hire a bunch of photographers to take a whole bunch of representative images so that you can then train based on those images. It's always going to be a very different model, though, than if you're just scraping the entire corpus of all possible pictures that have ever been taken. But yeah, I think at this point, the biggest facet that's going to impact it is really what the future holds in terms of the courts. If they rule one way or the other, it's going to dramatically change things. But from a researcher right now's perspective, I would be very leery of just going out and scraping data off the internet, because you are potentially, and somebody said it in the chat too, you could be on the wrong end of a lawsuit. And if you haven't followed your institutional policies, usually the institution won't protect you in those circumstances. So it would really be, you'd be on your own, potentially facing a lawsuit of some big corporation saying you stole their data, and that would not be a good thing. So I think really care and trying to seek authorization anytime before you do any sort of training is pretty important. But yeah, crystal ball time. I don't know.
That's pretty interesting because I'm trying to think as well. There might be in the future some kind of monetization structure or something where they share with all these websites and so on, all the information. So
yeah, there was, there's an excellent example of that. There was an app, I think it was called Neon, on the Apple App Store for a while, where they would pay you if they could record all your phone calls and use them to train their AI voice model. And it was like the #2 app on the App Store. So people were happily willing to throw away their privacy to get a little bit of money, which shocked me, but because I would never do that. But again, that's for some people, the money is just there. Yeah. And in the chat, saying there's apps that'll pay you for your visual likeness. If you see how easy it is with AI now to fake somebody's voice or fake videos of them or fake whatever, there's no way I would let my digital likeness go with permission to anything, or my voice, because it's just like, you can fake somebody's voice so easily now. It's not even funny. You need 10 seconds of them speaking and you got it. So it's crazy. Anyway, looks like it was a good one. Yeah, the webinar is enough. It's true. Absolutely. Scarily so. Yeah, it'd be pretty easy to fake, but not with permission. So there you go. Okay, I should probably go. Thanks, Saif. Appreciate it. Thanks to all those who stuck around and folks in the chat for being so engaged. It was awesome.